All right. My name is Joshua Waits. I'm the archivist here at VTS, and I am here with Sylvia Maria Booth, who has agreed to give her oral history for our LGBTQIA plus oral history project. Sylvia, thank you very much for being with us today.
My pleasure.
So I've given your name, but for the sake of the record, would you start by giving us your full name?
Of course. Sylvia Maria Booth.
Do you have a preferred name to be addressed by?
Just Sylvia is fine.
All right. Would you please tell us your pronouns and how you identify?
She, her, and I identify as bisexual.
All right. So we're going to start with some just sort of basic biographical information. So can you start off by telling us when and where you were born?
I was born January 31st, 1972 in Worcester, Massachusetts.
Would you be comfortable in telling us some of your family background and what it was like for you growing up?
Sure. So my dad was a diplomat. When I was born, it was actually a fluke that I was born in the United States. I was supposed to be born in Honduras because that's where my dad was posted at the time. But I was breech, and my mother had an uncle who was working at Hahnemann Hospital in Worcester. So, he sort of called her up and said, Maria, you got to come here and have your baby. So, which turned out to be a really good thing because I have PKU and they would not have identified it if I had been born in Honduras. So, but I only spent about 3 months in Worcester. Then, of course, we moved back to Tegucigalpa, where my parents were living. And sort of that started our family adventure. So I probably moved somewhere around 10 times, 10 to 12. Sometimes I forget because there's so many countries we went to before university. And I spent only about 2.5 years in the States in second and third grade. And, as most diplomats live in Virginia, I lived in somewhere around I don't remember exactly where in Falls Church, but I went to Sleepy Hollow Elementary School, if that will, sort of place it. But yeah, the rest of my life I spent living in countries outside the States, mostly in Europe, Latin America, and a little bit in the Middle East. So I'm not going to go through all the countries unless you're for some reason particularly interested in that. But yeah, we moved around about every 2.5 years. So I went to several different elementary schools, a couple of different high schools. And I actually did a 13th year of high school because by the time I was a senior in high school, I was in Geneva in Switzerland, and I was at a school that does the International Baccalaureate. And I wasn't sure whether I wanted to stay in Europe, like go to England for university, because most of my friends were going to British universities, or whether I wanted to go to the States. So I did the 13th year and I did the IB. But I ended up deciding to come back to the States because I figured it was about time I get to know my passport country. As our my third culture kid community calls the place you're supposed to be from, but you've never really lived in. So I came back to the States. I started undergrad at Tufts, and transferred to University of Michigan because, every 2 years I moved. So I sort of continued doing that. And then after undergrad, I sort of, since I grew up that way, I kind of continued moving. I did I wasn't really sure. I graduated with a degree in cultural anthropology and sort of almost a minor in English. It's about 3 credits short, and decided, okay, well, it's time to start figuring out what I can do with anthropology in the world. So I did a volunteership in Mexico for about 9 months, where I met and fell in love with my sort of ex-common law husband, who is French Canadian. And, you know, after my 9-month volunteership, sort of trying to figure out what to do next. By that time, my dad, Mexico City was where my dad was posted at the time. And his post was up by the end of my volunteership. He moved back to DC to do his last posting before he retired. And I was trying to figure out what to do next. I just knew Pierre, my ex, and I wanted to start a life together somewhere. I was applying to graduate schools in Canada. I was shooting very high, McGill, you know, and stuff like that. I didn't get in. So I was like, okay, what do we do now? So I sort of moved back to DC for about 9 months and lived with my dad, and I was working at Tourmobile while I was trying to figure out my next step. And Pierre and I kind of came up with a plan to learn to teach English abroad. And we moved to Poland and got degrees in TEFL, TEFL certificate, and started teaching English in Poland. And then we sort of, that was about maybe a year or so into that when my father decided that he was going to help me out with getting into a master's program. And he had some connections back in Mexico, since that he'd lived in Mexico several times. And he knew an anthropology professor, happened to meet him through a friend of a friend. He sort of told him about me, and this professor was very interested in like having someone from the States, you know, perhaps go and join the program in Mexico City in an anthropology research institute. And so I sort of decided to go there and take the test, and I got in. So I ended up doing a master's in social anthropology in Mexico City. And Pierre, you know, moved to be with me about 3 months. He was still teaching. He was in the second year of teaching. He sort of, you know, waited out the end of the year, and he moved to be with me. So I did that for a couple of years, graduated from that. And he was not happy in Mexico. So we sort of decided that the next place that we would move was up to him. He wanted to move back to Europe. So we decided to go to Italy for about 6 months and teach English. And after about 6 months of doing that, I was sort of sick of it, and I wanted to continue my studies. So I ended up, the professor that had been my director for my thesis in Mexico was French. There was an exchange between the university that I went to in Mexico and the Sorbonne. And I sort of showed up at his doorstep and said, you said if I was interested in continuing my studies that I could come knock on your door. Well, here I am. So I ended up enrolling in another master's because the French don't recognize the Mexican masters. So I had to sort of do it all over again, and then continued on to a PhD. And did my field research in Mexico. So I sort of became a Mexicanist specialist. I graduated, I got my PhD in 2011, but meanwhile, you know, we lived in France for a few years, and then I would go off and do field work in Mexico. Ended up doing close to 2 years of field work, because that was really the reason that I got into the PhD in the first place. Never really intended to be an academic. I was just in love with the idea of doing field work. Because, you know, Evans Pritchard and all the anthropologists, they went off and lived with people for a couple of years. And that was for me the fun part. But the, you know, graduate, you know, PhD takes a toll on relationships. And the time apart and everything like that. Meanwhile, Pierre ended up moving back to Canada. And while I was doing my fieldwork in Mexico, I was starting papers to immigrate to Canada, because that's sort of a thing that I always wanted to do. And so that was our plan. We were going to end up together in Canada. And I finished my fieldwork, managed to get all my paperwork through. And after I finished the fieldwork, I sort of went to Canada to live with Pierre for about a year. And the distance had taken a toll on us. So I decided to sort of suspend my work on my PhD for a year and just sort of be there. And, you know, immigration in itself is settling into a new country is a big process. So I decided to focus on that, to work, set aside some money, you know, focus on my relationship. And by the end of that year, I had saved up enough money to take 6 months off. I was working as an English teacher, still that's sort of the thing that's been the bread and butter, a TEFL teacher, bread and butter throughout my studies. And by then the relationship was deteriorating. So Pierre actually broke up with me about 2 weeks into, as soon as I'd taken my 6 months off. After I'd finished working, about 2 weeks into getting my space set up for writing my PhD, he was like, "Oh, we're done, and you know, you gotta move out, get your stuff together. You know, I'll give you some time, but you're out of here." So that was a big mess. That was a big, I sort of fell apart at that point. And I called my dad up, who by this time had moved back to the States, had gotten married, and had bought a house in Michigan. And I said, you know, I'd sort of toyed with the idea of staying in Montreal, which is where we were living. But it was too painful. It was one of those things where, like, everything I went reminded me of something about us. We'd been together 12 and a half years. So it was, I was a total mess. So I said, you know, Dad, I want to move home. And, you know, he drove up to help me pack up my stuff. And that's how I moved back to Michigan. And that is when that's when I started going to my home church, which would be the one who would raise me up to start the priesthood track. So that's kind of how I started down the path towards getting to seminary. I had become an Episcopalian in perhaps the end of 2010. Well, no, beginning of 2011, maybe. I had my conversion moment at the end of 2010 during my PhD process. Pierre and I had broken up in 2008. And it took me a couple of years for me to sort of, living at my dad's place, to kind of piece myself back together enough to get back on the PhD writing track and to, you know, find some work. I ended up doing a couple of consultancies in the United Nations, which brought me back to Geneva, where I had my really good friends from high school. And I ended up living with one of my friends from high school and her mom, who was renting a room out to me while I was doing these consultancies. So that was a really good time for me. But I, you know, and I was moving forward with writing my PhD, and I was about maybe one chapter away. I just had the conclusion to write. And I got a letter from the Sorbonne saying, your time is up. If you don't turn in your PhD in about a month, you are, you know, you fail, you're out. And so, you know, I went into a deep state of panic, obviously. And I was like, and that I had been an agnostic for most of my adult life.
Mm-hmm.
I'd been raised as, I had a complicated history with religion. My dad was an atheist, and I'm not quite sure what he is now. My mom was Christmas Catholic, not even Christmas and Easter, just Christmas Catholic. For some reason, Christmas Eve, we went to church and it was a big deal, but the rest of the year, like, you know, God didn't exist or religion, I don't know. And it was weird. And I had been, I'd done my first communion and I'd been confirmed together at 13 in the Catholic Church because my grandmother was a very devout Catholic. My mom was Italian, born and raised. My dad and my mom met in Rome, which was my dad's first posting. And my mom was 31 at that point, so 100% born and raised. And she was, even though she was nationalized American, she stayed Italian. But she did not have a really good relationship with religion for whatever reason, probably because my grandmother was very devout and my mom was probably reacting against that. But my mom was an artist, so and my dad loved classical music, so we'd go visit churches. I mean, I've been to God knows how many churches, and, you know, museums and stuff like that, but it was for the art. You know, it was for the windows, for the stained glass windows, for the paintings, you know, for the architecture, for the, you know, Bach, classical music, whatever. And there was always, you know, some mysterious thing, because, you know, churches in Europe, like you can visit it while people are actually having services or praying or whatever. There was some mysterious thing going on in the middle, which my parents never really gave me any guidance about whatsoever. But, you know, I think my grandmother leaned a little bit on my mom by the time I was reaching like 12 and 13 to be like, you know, this girl can't continue to be a heathen, like, you know, she needs to do her first communion and confirmation. Like, you need to get her at least, get her to church at least to do that stuff. She's been baptized. She needs to do the next steps, you know. So, and at that point, I actually really, and I had a very strange kind of catechism, which was kind of I would go to, you know, the way you do piano lessons at somebody's house, like a private thing, like I'd go and have like catechism tutorial, which is like weird because we wouldn't go to church or anything like that. I just sort of have catechism at the catechism teacher's house. It was very bizarre. But I really sort of got into it. And I came out of it with the sense that, you know, Jesus loves me and Jesus is my friend, but not much of an understanding of anything else that was going on, and not really an understanding of what church was. So I kind of, you know, strayed off the path and became an agnostic for most of my adult life. But yeah, I had that conversion moment where I was just like, okay, this is it. You know, I've lost my relationship. I can't lose the PhD too. Like, I can't lose everything. And I just sort of had to get down on your knees and, you know, God, if you really exist, like, help, I can't lose this too. And about 3 weeks later, I was presenting at a conference for, you know, presenting a partial conclusion of my PhD. And I decided to go visit the registrar and like beg, plead, cry, throw myself on the floor, like do anything to get an extension, which with the French is very difficult because they lead with no. But, you know, I walked in there and I was speaking to the secretary. And, you know, I told her what I was there for, and she's like, oh, that stupid letter. I can't believe they sent that out. Just ignore that. It doesn't apply. No explanation, no meeting with anybody. I was just sort of like stunned. And I just sort of stood there and went, okay, thanks. And sort of walked out of there and was just like, I think that was the miracle that I asked for. I guess God does exist. And I got a 1-year reprieve. But, you know, I'm walking down the corridor. By the time I got to the end of the corridor, I was like, okay, God does exist. I guess I should get to know God. Where can I do that? In church. Which church should I go to? And the next answer was immediate, was the Episcopal Church. And that is a whole other backstory, because I'd actually, on my breakup with Pierre, I had met a friend who was a social worker doing nonprofit work in Mexico during my field work. She'd actually wandered into the village where I was doing my field work, which is this tiny, tiny little Mixtec village on the top of a mountain in Oaxaca. Like, this is God, like, obviously. And we'd become friends, and her husband happened to be an Episcopal priest in Boston. So when the breakup happened, just about 2 or 3 days later, I called her up and told her, and she's like, get on a bus, get on a train, come down here. We're about to go on a sailing trip. We're going to take you with us on vacation. You need this. Come down here. Don't worry about money. Don't worry about anything. Just come. And I went on the trip with them, and it was wonderful. It was exactly what I needed. And at the end of that week, Warren, this is Warren Bradkey, the father of the actual director of Episcopal Relief and Development, I think he was the rector at the church, the Episcopal church in downtown, Old Town in Boston, whose name I forget, but he was working on his sermon Saturday morning at breakfast, and we're having conversation about it. And Judith, his wife, convinced me to go to church the next day. And lo and behold, like, some of the things that I'd said had actually made it into the sermon. And I was like, what? Like, you actually listened to anything that I said? Like, I'm at this point, I'm just like, I'm an apostate. I'm like, I practice, Catholic. I was like, I'm not clean. I can't come to the altar. I've abandoned the church, whatever, all that kind of stuff, that the Catholic stuff I was carrying around with me. And time came for the Eucharist, and he was like, everyone is welcome at the altar. And I was like, what? And Judith is like, come on, let's go. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, I'm a fallen Catholic. Like, I can't do this. But she convinced me to go up. I did the thing with the crossing your hands. And so later, I was like, well, I was welcomed back when I wasn't even searching. So, yeah, the Episcopal Church was the obvious answer. So my first church that I went to was the church in Paris, which is where I was sort of finishing up, polishing up the end of my dissertation and getting ready to defend it. And, I was just kind of one of those people sitting at the back of the pew. But there was a lady rector, which I'm like, I'd never seen that before. And I was just basically there to hear the sermon. And, when I ended up going to Geneva, the next year, I got my contract to do my consultancy, a couple of different organizations of the United Nations. I ended up going to Emmanuel Church in Geneva. That was my second Episcopal congregation. But it wasn't until I moved to Michigan after, the breakup happened, that I was really going consistently to an Episcopal church. And that was a church that about after a year, I got, the tap on the shoulder with the rector there saying, had I ever considered the priesthood? So that's what sort of catapulted me onto my trip into seminary. But in terms of anything related to, so that's just kind of like the general context. But in terms of anything related to LGBTQ and having any sense of who I was in all of this, I think with hindsight, as a person that has now sort of knows herself a lot better than I used to when I was younger, and has come to sort of realize who she is, I can see the trail of breadcrumbs leading up to where I am now. But I think I was raised in a family, they weren't overtly anti-LGBTQ, but it's just, you kind of, it was absorbed through osmosis. So my dad would say stuff like, oh yes, gay people deserve, of course they deserve the equal rights at work. And of course they deserve to be partnered with people and be able to have, go to the hospital and visit them and stuff like that. But this marriage thing, that's wrong. Like, marriage is between a man and a woman. This is coming from an atheist. And I was just like, what? Anyway, this is a conversation that we'd have. I mean, but I knew it was sort of like, yes, they deserve not to be discriminated against, but, like, that's like, they're sick. It's not really right. And like, this was kind of in the, it's that sort of progressive family that thinks they're really progressive, but actually they don't recognize their discrimination. So that was kind of, it wasn't talked about, but it was sort of in the air and in the water in my family. So I don't think I was in a position to really understand myself very well. But looking back, I can kind of trace the breadcrumbs. Like, when I was in 4th grade, I had a really, really good friend called Carla Conde. And how you just know that someone is gay, even before you can like verbalize that, even before you know that word, like, you're too young to even know what it means. But I knew Carla. Carla and I used to run around and get into trouble together. We'd be climbing trees and like, doing all sorts of Dennis the Menace kind of stuff together. And you just know. I just had a sense that I knew she was just different. I just kind of knew she wasn't interested in boys. She wasn't interested in makeup, and in 4th grade, you're starting to get, the girls doing the makeup and that stuff is happening. And me and her were like thick as thieves. We used to run around together. And, when I used to have the most fun playing, most of my friends at that age were boys, and I used to run around with them and climb trees and do all sorts of stuff. And for me, it was just normal. My one thing my mother insisted on is to, let me explore. Like, she didn't try and like pen me into like, a girl's supposed to behave like this. And so, like, they, insisted on letting me express myself and run around and just be myself. I don't think they were thinking about sexuality at this point. I think they were just thinking, a kid deserves to run around and be free and have fun. But at one point in 4th grade, there was a group of what I would now call mean girls, who were, already putting on the makeup and, doing their hair up and with the pearls and all that kind of stuff. And the leader of this group was, I'll never forget her name, Crystalline. Like, to this day, I hate that name. And at one point, there was an incident where I was walking down the steps towards the area where we were off to do, on break, to go out and play. And she was her and her group of 2 or 3 other mean girls were right behind me, and they're like, "Oh, she's such a boy," or "She's a boy," or I don't know. They said something like that, and that infuriated me so much that I sort of turned around, grabbed her by the lapels, and just sort of jumped on top of her and started kind of punching on her, of course, proving her point. But yeah, I mean, I used to, and looking back on it, I realize now, I'm like, I was different. Carla was different. We knew it. The other kids knew it. Nobody had any words for it, but this is how it came out. And yeah, I can remember, around in 3rd and 4th grade, you're starting to sort of, get interested in exploring, you're kind of into boys, or you're into, like, you're sort of, that sort of stuff starts to awaken in you. And I used to have crushes on boys, but also didn't recognize, or sort of in secret to myself, was also kind of crushing on some of my female friends. But it wasn't anything that I could verbalize or admit to myself, because somehow I knew, like, it wasn't, I wasn't supposed to let that stuff out.
Mhm.
You know, so fast forward to undergrad. And I was, you know, I was in college in the 90s in the States. And that was a time when, you know, when the, you know, what's it? I kissed a girl and I liked it. And, you know, being bi and stuff like that was fashionable. And sort of everybody was supposed to go through their, you know, bi phase and explore things with girls. And my personality is such that if everybody else is doing something, I'm going to not do that because that irritates the living daylights out of me. But at the same time, like in junior year of university, I was at U of M, developed a very close friendship with a friend of mine who's still to this day my best friend. And we used to, you know, hang around once again, thick as thieves. And all of her roommates were gay. And everyone, and I didn't think about it at the time. I was like, yeah, okay. So her roommates are gay, big deal. Like this is, you know, I was like, this is normal. This is just part of university life. I had tons of friends who were gay. We used to go out to the disco at University of Michigan. Was it on Thursday or Friday nights? I don't remember. Used to have gay night. And, you know, I mean, like that was the preferred night that I would go out with my friends and go dancing there. And in my mind, it was always like, oh no, it's safer. It's safer because you won't get the guys hitting on you and you can just have fun with your friends and stuff like that. But I also used to be flattered when some of the girls would come up and ask me to dance. So, but at the same time, you know, I was dating guys and I was sort of, you know, so it was not, I was like, well, duh, like I'm straight because I'm into guys, right? There's no other alternative. Like there's no other, and you know, that's either this or that. And I like guys, so it can't be that. It was, yeah. But at the same time, you know, like I was going to U of M, and Ann Arbor was very, in the 90s, Ann Arbor was very progressive and very kind of liberal and but Ypsilanti, just right next to Ann Arbor, little did I know at that time was, and still is, an LGBTQ plus kind of like hotspot. It's a hub, you know, it's actually a wonderful place. If I was going to move back to Michigan, I was like, I'd already decided in seminary, if I moved back to Michigan, you know, at the end of seminary or whatever, which I was gonna, because I was coming out of the Diocese of Michigan, I'm like, I'm only going to live in Ypsilanti because I love it there. You know, and at the time, like my best friend Kate and all of her roommates, she was actually living in Ypsilanti because she had transferred out from a community college in Ypsi to U of M. So she was still living in Ypsi, her roommates were there, and we used to go out to parties in Ypsi, and all of the parties in Ypsi were LGBTQ plus. Like you know, the parties I used to go to, it was all girls. And I remember thinking, oh, you know, wow, some of these girls are really pretty, and oh, isn't it nice that some of the pretty girls, you know, are hitting on me and stuff like that. But I didn't think more than that of it. And, you know, it was just sort of like, especially since it was in the air that at that time that it's like, well, of course, everybody's at least a little bit bi, obviously. Like like it was kind of like, it was kind of permeating the atmosphere at that time. So I thought, well, obviously, like, doesn't everybody kind of, you know, lean both ways a little bit? Like, oh, it's just, you know, other people won't admit it or whatever. Which, you know, but come to realize later that it was not that the fact that I had that thinking, it was sort of like, no, everybody isn't like that. You're like that, which is why you think it's obvious that everybody else is. It hadn't dawned on me. And to be perfectly honest, there were moments where I was sure, even when I would start to sort of question myself a little bit, I had some internalized prejudice. And, you know, when I was hanging out with Kate's friends, Kate's roommates, and they would be watching movies and there'd be some, you know, kissing and stuff going on, I was uncomfortable. I was really uncomfortable, and come to realize afterwards that I had had this internal reaction of rejection to nope, this has nothing to do with me. And now, you know, with hindsight, I realized that was a lot of internalized anti, you know, gay sentiment that I had, you know, sort of absorbed in through osmosis. But since it wasn't talked about, since it was, of course we don't discriminate and stuff, like I couldn't identify it or put a name on it. So, you know, all of this led me to believe, like, well, of course, you know, this has nothing, like, you know, obviously everybody's a little bit bi, but I like guys, so this can't be me, you know, like, so it was just, it's weird. It's weird to think that even though the information is out there, even though like there's a seemingly favorable environment and there's seeming like acceptance, it's not the same as being an affirming environment. And you know, and it's because and maybe it was also the 90s. I'm not sure that everybody had the language to understand, you know, the internalized like self-hatred and stuff like that of, you know, I don't think, and I was doing gender studies, interestingly enough, you know, Native American and gender studies. I went to tons of gender studies classes, but still somehow, despite all of this, like the language wasn't necessarily there. And my friendship with Kate is an element of this as well, because we were so close, like we would do everything together. And I think at one point, like every time we had spring break, like we would go off together, like we'd do road trips to visit her family and stuff like that. And I remember at one point her family wondering, like, are you guys like together or something? Like, what's, you know, like the, you know, the questioning and stuff like that. And for me, I was like, what? No, we're just friends. So that was, and I do, you know, I do consider her as a sister. That there's never been any romantic attraction on my part, but that doesn't necessarily mean, like, that is something I still haven't entirely figured out, whether we had perhaps something akin to a Boston marriage, you know, where like you have like part of the relationship, but you don't have another part. Anyway, so that's, yeah, so I don't think that I don't think that I started to really realize that I'm bi until I was in seminary. And it's not VTS. It actually started at Bexley Seabury, because I started, I believe, in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And I really wanted to stay in Bexley Seabury has a program where you can stay in your home diocese and do your internship in a parish in your home diocese. And I was really into Latino ministry, as I still am. And there was a church plant effort happening with a couple of friends of mine that I had actually sort of done a bit of volunteering with, which is how I sort of realized that I was into Latino ministry, which didn't pan out. But then there was also another church in the congregation that wanted to start a Latino, you know, it was an Anglo church and wanted to start a Latino congregation in a neighborhood where it was highly, it's more than 40-50% Mexican American, especially Latino. And I was all gung-ho about this, and I'm like, oh, I want to learn how to do this. And, you know, I thought I was going to be able to plant a congregation. I don't know. You're young, you're naive, you're not really sure what you're doing, but you're all excited. So I was like, I want to stay here and do this. So that's why I ended up going to Bexley. And that was a really wonderful experience. I think stuff was happening internally inside me, but I don't think I would have come to the language or the realization of what was going on unless I was in that environment. And from day one, Bexley was it was a very affirming environment. Like it's a very small class of people that, do any one sort of year. And one of my classmates was just extremely open about being bi, and just 100% comfortable in her skin. And it was sort of an environment where it was a given that, we are 100, not just tolerant, not just accepting, not just inclusive, but 100% affirming and nurturing.
Mhm.
I just got that from the atmosphere, from, our professors. It's a very progressive leaning seminary, but the content of the classes, a lot of the professors are very openly LGBTQ plus and very active in, the Episcopal Church affirming that. So and it's just the way things are talked about. It's just the way, like, it was just, at one of my professors for community organizing is the now bishop of the Diocese of Michigan. And I can remember, and she's, not only openly lesbian, but very like, yeah, I'm lesbian. So what? Like, this is, why are we still talking about this? Like, this is, it's obvious that everything is, this is great. Like, duh. Like, this is an old conversation. Like, let's get on to other things. Like, it's so, like, it was just so obvious that it was great. And, it's like, it's fabulous, and everything's wonderful. And we like it was just, there wasn't a question
Mhm.
of affirming and celebrating and just loving all of the expressions of LGBTQ. Like the professors specifically taught in a way that it was like, we all know this, we all affirm this, and everybody in the class, and it wasn't like an imposition, do you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
it was all sort of an agreed upon yes, and enthusiastic, and an enthusiastic yes. So it was a very it was a very nurturing environment that allowed me to sort of like say it out loud. And meanwhile, in my own sort of internal mental realization of things, I had realized that that I'd sort of developed a crush on someone in my home church congregation, which I couldn't follow up on because she was, in a relationship. But, it's a sort of a thing that I had a dream about her. And then the next day I sort of saw her, and it was just sort of like, it's the sort of thing that you're embarrassed that you've had a dream about somebody. And you're like, okay, I don't know where to put myself. But, so of course, crushes happen, and, you learn to manage them, and then they sort of eventually fade away and everything is fine. But what it made me realize was like, oh, no, 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 this thing is real. This thing is real. This is not just, oh, like I used to think in undergrad, oh, everybody's a little bit bi, or, like, no, 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 no. This is like, this is part of me. This is a true and real part of me, and it's always been there.
Mhm.
And it sort of showed up in these little ways that I just wasn't, I had to knock down some prejudices. I had to get to know myself better. I had to, whatever I had to go through to get to a point where I was like, and the interesting thing, my first reaction to this wasn't immediate, like, oh, yay, great, I know myself better. My first reaction was like, oh my God, what else don't I know about myself? Like, how can I just be discovering this now? Um, you know, like what else is in there that I haven't fully acknowledged or whatever. Like I was a bit freaked out by, not by it being a reality, but by how did I not know this before? Like, how am I just figuring this out now? But but that sort of faded away, and then I was like, okay, so it took me some time to figure it out, but now I know. And now I know, and okay, this is really cool. But Bexley was the first place that I felt safe to say it out loud, because I knew I wasn't going to get any reaction at all. Like, it was just sort of like, okay, great. And I was like, wow, wow, that was amazing to me. Yeah. What it has been in congregations and stuff like that, however, has been different.
So did you finish at Bexley Seabury?
What happened at Bexley was I was having issues with balancing some of the classes, because some of the classes were online only and the other ones were in person. And I was having issues balancing the online classes with a full-time job. So I got into academic probation, and they decided that perhaps the model at VTS would be better, where I would have like full support, financial support and stuff like that. And they helped me do the application to sort of transfer over to VTS.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you transfer from Bexley to VTS.
Mm-hmm.
Did you find VTS to be that same affirming place that Bexley Seabury was?
I wouldn't say same. So there's some differences that I think are also due to the nature of the schools. First of all, Bexley was a much smaller program. There were fewer of us. And we would do these intensive weekends of class and retreats and week-long things. So we got really close. And I think VTS is more towards the center of the Episcopal spectrum, more what I would call kind of a typical big tent kind of a seminary. Whereas Bexley is very much on the, progressive UCC end of the spectrum. So no, not the same. And also I think that's because of the nature of, when you have a seminary where you admit more people from all of the ends of the spectrum of the tent, you realize that you're also going to be in class with people who don't approve of your, way of living, don't approve of you of being, someone being LGBTQ, that they don't know what to do with that necessarily. I have never openly felt anybody say anything or do anything. It's once again, it's sort of an atmosphere. On the other hand, VTS is also very supportive. So it's kind of a mixed bag. So while I was at VTS, I was also not entirely in the loop of everything that's going on. I ended up, because of the pandemic and stuff like that, and because of being in a residence and the fact that I'd given up my apartment in Michigan, so thus VTS was my only place to live, ended up, and the times when VTS was closed, when we'd need to be out of the dorms, VTS was kind enough to connect me with Laura Nada and Catherine Wood, And they ended up being the place that I would stay when, on Christmas break or on summer break. And they ended up being kind of my bubble, part of my bubble during the pandemic. And that was, and I don't think it's necessarily, I don't know whether it's a coincidence or it isn't a coincidence, because I don't know how the decision got made to suggest Laura and Catherine, whether they volunteered, or I don't know how the pairing was made. But Herschel was also another person that was part of, staying at VT, perhaps because we were both at St. George's. I'm not sure exactly how that connection got made, because I think it was Dr. Hook who suggested it. And I will be eternally grateful to her for that, because they've become my very, very best friends. And, Laura and Catherine would have dinners, and, they're my found family now. Like, I adore all of them. Laura, Catherine, and Herschel are I'm very excited that they're staying in the area, because, yeah, we're going to continue to be friends no matter what. But yeah, they would have dinners on Sunday nights, and that's when I would hear what's going on campus, because there'd be about, they'd invite a whole bunch of people over. So, I'd hear I was a little bit out of it. So I'd hear, stuff that was going on, and I'd hear conversations. And that's more how I knew that there were instances in classes or whatever, or conversations over lunch or wherever, where it had become obvious to, part of the LGBT group on campus that, there were folks that were like, we're not too sure about you guys. But it was more of an interpersonal thing, it's just, so I didn't personally witness any of that. There are conversations happen, and you hear stuff through the grapevine. So, I was aware. But on the other hand, I never felt personally like anything that VTS ever did anything that wasn't supportive. I never, like the professors, I always, either I didn't know what their position was, or I felt like some of them were extremely supportive. And I got, I think it was a mixed, I definitely got the sense that you're welcome here. We're trying to, especially from the junior class coming in, that, there's a large proportion of the junior class that is young gay men. So there's an obvious desire to be welcoming and to be inclusive. And there's a lot of, what can we do? And how can we support you better? There was, I felt a lot of that. On the other hand, I also know that that wasn't necessarily shared across the board, because of what I would hear, in the real talk of, the conversations of Sunday night dinner. So it's not the same, because Bexley was unquestionably, I felt that it was, or if anything had happened that wasn't that way, I never heard about it. I felt it was unquestionably, yeah, obviously, supported. Whereas VTS, I think there's yes, but also, there are folks who are like, I don't know about this. But there's never, that's personal. Everybody has their personal opinions and their personal leanings. It was not tolerated for them to actually do anything that was considered unwelcoming. So do you know what I mean? So it's sort of like, it's not the same.
Right.
Exactly. But also, yeah.
When you talk about the atmosphere, atmosphere of tension, as it were.
Yes.
Was that, in your opinion, or in your view, was that mainly an atmosphere among the student body, or was it also part of the faculty and staff as well?
That's a great question. I feel like I experienced it personally more as an issue of the student body. I would say I'm not sure about the faculty and staff. There are some faculty that I'm sure that were supportive because, I spent time with them, and you can just, you just know. Like Reverend Altagracia, the both of the Heaney's, like it's just you just know. You just know from how people are with you and interpersonal relationships. There are faculty that I imagine that are, just because I know of their, just stuff that they said in class and stuff, but we don't know each other, didn't spend enough time and didn't have a personal enough relationship that I would be able to like test that out. And, and I know the dean has always, just the way he comes across and statements he makes, seems totally supportive. But there's some faculty that I don't really know very well, and I don't know, and I wasn't necessarily thinking about it. So that's more of a question mark for me. Like there's folks that I know, and I know that they're supportive, and I know, they're wonderful, and they're also, part of the community, and some that are not necessarily part of the community, but they're supportive. And then there's the others are perhaps, I'm not sure. I don't know. It's more of a question mark.
Okay. Can you tell me about your involvement with PRISM?
Yeah, that was interesting. So I think when I first arrived, first of all, I was surprised that there was an organization. And that I find interesting, because I find like, and this is just my conclusion, I'm like, if it makes more sense, because I feel like VTS is a larger school and more of a picture of, the society in general, that you would need an organization, and that there would be student organizations and stuff like that. I think Bexley was so small that there aren't any student organizations. So I didn't know that there was one in the beginning. I was surprised that there was, but I was also like, oh, that's exciting. Like I'm glad that there is one, and I'm excited to participate and find out what it's all about. So I think in the first year, I sort of participated in things. I wanted to find out more about it. But I think the fact that Kathleen and I became good friends, really, and she was the president of the organization, sort of really had me. I'm not sure if I was participating that much from 2020 to 2021, but I was interested and curious, and, obviously willing. And I think Kathleen perhaps saw that. So I ended up, I think in the first year that I was there, when I was a middler, I think the only thing that I did that was overtly PRISM was go to the student activities fair, was it? And, there was, I think, PRISM had a table out, and, there were t-shirts and flags or whatever. And I was just like, oh, this is exciting. And I wasn't quite sure what PRISM was going to do. But I was sort of there. I'm like, yeah, I'm there for that. And I just think mainly hanging around with Kathleen and having conversations with her, I found out more about what PRISM does. And I think perhaps that's why for the second year, since we were friends, I think Kathleen was like, oh, I'm leaving. I'm gonna have to, give PRISM over to somebody. And she's like, are you, you've shown an interest and enthusiasm, and you want to find out more about the organization, and would you be interested in being the president? And I was like, me by myself? No. Like if there can be a co-president or someone else who's been in PRISM longer, yeah, I would be willing to do it. And that's when I think Adam also came on board. And I think, I was like, okay, if it's the two of us, I'm willing to do it, because I'm not sure that, I'm not sure I've been with you guys long enough, or that I know enough, about how this is all run, or anything, that I don't feel like I would be very comfortable at all being responsible for it. So, the fact that it was two of us together, and plus Adam and I were friends as well. He was another person that also made me feel very comfortable, just sort of being me on campus. So yeah, so that, and the prospect of doing that together, it sounded like fun. So when we got all of the documents and the information from Kathleen and how things are run and stuff like that, I think a lot of it was also consulting with Laura and Catherine, who are, just naturals in entertaining, because they do that they have the Sunday dinner all the time. I was like, oh, okay. And asking Adam and sort of asking some other folks, I'm like, what are the sort of things? And I'd participated, I think, in the Trans Day of Remembrance like the year before. And I'm like, okay, so I know this happens. I know, the Trans Day of Remembrance is a big thing. I know we've got the fair, where we have a table. I'm like, but like, what else has Prism done? Like, what should we be doing? What are, and I don't remember whether it was in conversation with Adam or with you guys as well, or also with Laura and Catherine. I think the idea of like a welcome dinner came up. And I don't remember exactly who suggested it or how it all sort of that idea came about, but that seemed to make a lot of sense to me, because I remember that I was feeling, and I don't know what, like, once again, this is all emails and conversations back and forth. So who exactly said what and where it came from is not something that I remember clearly, but I can kind of remember personally feeling like, I feel like it is important for all of the folks who are LGBTQ, who have something to do with VTS, students, faculty, spouses of everybody, and people who work there. Everybody like needs to, I feel like it took me a long time to figure out that Prism was there the first year. And I'm like, first of all, I think everybody needs to know that we're here. And I think, but the first event should be for us. And I believe that I think I asked Laura and Catherine's advice on that, and I think they were the ones who were like, may we suggest this, that the first event be only us. And I was like, you know what, that makes a lot of sense. And so I felt like a dinner and something to, where we could just let our hair down and celebrate and relax, and also it's like a calling in, just letting people know, hey, we're here, this is for us. We want to celebrate. We want to, get to know each other. We want to welcome the new, juniors and stuff like that who are coming, like we, for multiple reasons. And it needed to be kind of a fun thing. I am not good at organizing parties or things. That was like my mom's forte. So I've had a, diplomat's wife and stuff like that, and like cocktail parties and receptions, and that was her thing. So I sort of was like, I don't know how to do this, but thank God, there was a whole bunch of us, and somehow we pulled it together, and I think, and it was, I feel like, because I didn't really know what I was doing. This is the first time I was pulling something like this together, probably more chaotic than it should have been. But thankfully, so many folks like stepped in and showed up for it. And that was the fun part. I was like, wow, there's real enthusiasm about this. Like, this is obviously something that the community needs, because they're excited about it. When you organize things and nobody's really interested, like, it just doesn't, because it was all your idea and nobody else really wanted it or needed it. This was not that. At least I didn't feel that this was that. So I was really excited about that. And I felt like it was interestingly difficult to find a space for it. I don't know whether that's, and I don't have enough, like I say, I'm not good at organizing stuff like that. So I don't have enough experience knowing whether that was just logistics or whether it was, because when the dinner happened, it felt fabulous. Like, it felt like a lot of people came and people really stayed late and there was laughing and people really enjoyed themselves. But I also felt like we were off in a corner, and part of me was like, maybe we should be off in a corner because kind of this is for us. But part of it was like, I kind of felt sometimes that like people were like, oh, what's that weird thing happening over there? You know, I don't know how to feel about that. I'm not entirely sure. It's once again, it's my first time organizing anything like that, and this was all new to me. And so I'm like, the logistics of it were like, ugh, archaic to me.
Well, this was also, from what I understand, this was the first time that the PRISM hosted the event on their own.
Really?
In years past, a professor had hosted it at their house.
Ah, yes. Okay. Right.
Bill Roberts had always hosted it at his house. And no faculty really had stepped up to make that offer to PRISM again since after he retired. And I think one, because it was just, that was what he did. And so nobody thought, oh, I need to step up to that. I also know that that was also the first time that PRISM had ever invited spouses
Really?
of
I didn't know that.
the spouses of staff and faculty to attend.
I did not know that. See, this is like, I just sort of like, this sort of landed in my lap and I was like, I'm clueless about how to do this. So I asked like, friends of mine that were better at doing this. And that just sort of came out of those conversations. But it seemed to me like the whole point of this is like the LGBT community it's not just us students. It's like, it's a campus-wide thing, right? So it seemed, I don't know.
Yeah,
But
I
anyway,
got
that's
several
interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I got several messages from different staff spouses thanking us for including them because it had been the first time that they had ever been invited to anything, specifically invited to something at VTS where they were actually like part of the initial plan and not just, oh yeah, and you can bring your spouse if you want to.
Oh, that's interesting. I did not know that. See, like I said, I sort of just stepped into this thing and like not knowing the history, I was just sort of like, okay, let's do this, whatever, we'll figure it out. That's interesting. That's a shame, but also I'm glad that we did it then. Really glad that we did it.
So why did you not finish your degree at VTS?
I think it was a combination of things. It's still something I'm digesting. I ended up being on academic probation a couple of semesters in a row. So I think part of it, yeah, I just wasn't doing well at VTS. I think part of it was I was coming to the realization, but resisting coming to the realization that I don't actually want to be a priest, which has been one of the most liberating realizations I've ever had. And I'm so glad it happened ungracefully and to a certain extent. It was kind of a mess, but I'm glad that it happened. Yeah, I just kind of shut down, I think, which was what happened. I was not showing up at classes anymore. I wasn't handing things in. I think part of it was motivated by this sort of sense of like a train sort of barreling towards, and I might just graduate and I might just get ordained and I might just end up doing this. And I don't want to do this. So I don't, and it's just, it's also personal coping mechanisms, which, I need to work on. But yeah, I just think I ended up shutting down. And the school did what the school in the contract said it would do, that, after I was on academic probation the first semester, they said, well, okay, you can continue, but, if it happens 2 semesters in a row, we are going to ask you to take a year and leave VTS, and then we'll leave that window open, but we'll consider you reapplying if at the end of that year you want to reapply. So that's, that's what happened. I was on academic probation 2 semesters in a row, and I was asked to leave VTS. But meanwhile, what had happened personally the year before was in the summer between, was it 2020 and 2021? Between the end of, 2021 summer and 2021 fall. That summer, I had actually, I was cat sitting for Dr. Hook for, I think maybe a month or so, like Dr. Hook and her wife were away on vacation. And, it was the summer and I was continuing to work and stuff like that. But I had this habit of going to walk, and there's kind of like an park area not too far away that kind of leads to, what is it called? Fort something, or I don't remember. There's this kind of like
Fort Ward Park.
Fort Ward Park, right? And then there's this kind of like green trail behind like the housing complexes kind of area back there, which I discovered really late during the first year, and that was my place that I would go to walk and think and clear my head and connect with God. And I had a really frank conversation with God where I actually, for the first time, admitted out loud that I did not want to be a priest. And then, and got support and approval and the okay from God on that. Like God was like, finally, I'm glad you figured it out. Yay. And I had a great conversation with my bishop, who was my bishop and the standing committee and everything, because I was a postulant at this point. And she was like, it was a good conversation. It was kind of a holy moment, because she was like, she was very glad. I mean, it just, the relief on my part was palpable, that I sort of, once I'd gotten the okay from God, I was like, I knew everything else would go well, even though I was terrified to talk to the bishop. But yeah, she was thrilled with it. She's like, I always wanted you to do what you need to do, and I'm glad you figured this out, and we're very happy about this. So she's like, okay, we're going to give you about a year to figure out what you want to do next, whether you want to continue at VTS or what you want to do with that, whether you want to come back to Michigan. So at this point, I let VTS know what was going on, and I stepped off the MDiv track, and I sort of negotiated with them to do a master's in theology instead. And I had an idea for a thesis. So I thought, yay, that's the way to go. I think part of me was like, the academic in me was like, I started this thing. I need to finish this thing. Like it's not going to an MDiv. I'm not, that sort of worry has been taken off my plate. But, let's get this degree. You don't start a degree and not finish it. But I just don't think I wasn't in the right place. Like that wasn't what I was meant to do. I don't think I really wanted to. I think part of me was like, I can't, I can't just walk away from this. I don't want to just let go of like the degree and everything altogether for practical purposes. But also I think I've been in academia for so long that, once you board that train, you don't get off. Like you get the degree. But I don't think my heart was really in it anymore. So I just sort of think but I don't think I had worked that out with myself. So I just think my internal coping mechanism just said, okay, you're not listening to us, so we're gonna do this our way, and we're gonna shut you down, and we're gonna throw you into a depression, and you're just gonna kind of skid off the tracks instead of exiting gracefully.
I heard a priest, Roman Catholic priest, talking about discernment. And he said, there's 3 questions you should always ask yourself when it comes to discernment. He said, 1, is there a door? He said, because if there is no door, then you're banging up against a wall.
Yep.
Said, two, is the door open? He said, because there very well may be a door, but that's not the door that you can go through. He said, and then three, he said, and this is the most important one. He says, do you want to go through the door?
Mm-hmm.
Which was this, when I was doing my discernment, it was like this very liberating thought process, sort of like the first time you'd heard a religious leader go, you're not going to disappoint God if you say to God, I don't want to do that. God will
Yeah.
go, God will go, okay, fine. Here's another door. You get to tell God what you would like to do.
Yeah, I think it took me a long time to figure out that was possible.
Mhm.
And then I don't know, and then that, the second, it was just sort of, it's hard to get off a moving train,
Mhm.
so like I think I probably should have, but there was a lot at stake too, because I mean, saying that the summer of 21, saying I don't want to be a priest and I also have no interest in finishing this degree, because what for, was, I think if it was too terrifying for me at that point, because it's like, well, I lose my place to live, and like, where do I go? What do I do? Like, I was all in at that point,
No.
like my livelihood, my everything, I was all in. So
And
it
your
was,
levels of security, you have to protect them.
yep,
If your base needs aren't met, you can't think about the other needs.
exactly. So part of it felt like, okay, academic, I can do this. I know how to do this. I've had degrees before. I can finish the degree, and that'll keep, I'll be fed. I'll be like, I think and also like, also there was something that I was really interested in. And I'm like, I've written a thesis before. There's a fascinating topic. I can do this. I can do this, and I want to do this. Yeah. Anyway,
And the
so
body is always wiser than our brain is.
yes. Yep. My body was like, okay, you're going to try and force this thing. We're not cooperating.
Yeah.
So we're going to shut you down.
Well, thank you
Yep.
for sharing that. I know
Yep.
that's not an easy thing to talk
No, because
about.
I'm still kind of embarrassed about it. There's still a degree of shame around it. So
Well, no, I don't think there should be any shame about that, because also listening to your story, I go, you are someone who was born. God, God, God put you into this world in a place of mobility,
mm-hmm.
um, and with the ability to adapt and flow around the globe, quite literally. I mean, it's almost hard to say you're American. You're very international. You know, um, it's like, okay, could we say that you are truly American in your culture? Well, I mean, you're Honduran, you're uh, French and Swedish and and American. You're this complex individual that has traveled the world and has been able to really almost at a moment's notice pack up your whole life and move to the next exciting adventure. It would be rather cruel to put a collar on you.
Yeah, that's partly the way I feel. So here's an interesting other wrinkle. The place that I did not leave was my internship church.
Mm-hmm.
So I was at San Jose and Cristo Rey for my internship, middler year and stuff like that. I started there almost immediately in September, and I'm still there
Mm-hmm.
because those places felt, first of all, I needed some place grounding, and also, they're my churches now. I feel at home there. And I am back in discernment again. I'm a seeker again.
Mhm.
So I planted my flag in the Diocese of Virginia now, and I'm considering whether the diaconate may or may not be a calling, or whether there's a lay ministry that needs to be developed.
Mhm.
I take your point about the door open. Like that's one thing that happened to me after I stepped away from VTS, is that I think God gave me back myself. And I
Mhm.
think that process started that summer of 2021. And I've been in this kind of wide open space, but yet in that space I've been more than I wanted to in the initial, reckoning of everything. I was just like, okay, I'm just going to keep doing what I'm doing, show up on Sundays, do what I do, and just hang out with my congregation. And, they want me to preach, I'll preach, whatever. I'll just, just kind of just keep floating along and just heal from this whole thing. And I've been asked to like lead services, and I'm just like, they were asking me to do more stuff once I stepped away. And once I told people, no, I'm not there anymore. I stepped off the priest track. I'm so happy that I did that. I want to go back. I've been asked to do more things. So I'm like, okay, Holy Spirit, what are you doing now? Why are you messing with me again? Like, what's happening? So I don't know. I don't know what's in the cards. Like, I'm very sort of like, I think the key was to let go of the outcome.
Mm.
And that's what I was not able to do. So I like being in discernment again. I don't, as far as I'm concerned, if whatever the outcome is, something's happening. So there's, some ministry that God still wants me to do. And I'm excited to have a discernment committee that's going to help me figure that out. And, I'm very dubious about whether putting a collar on anything is going to help. It's only
Mhm.
if I'm absolutely convinced that there's some reason, even a deacon's collar, some reason to be putting a collar on any of it.
Mhm.
But yeah, exactly. I feel the way you feel now. It's like, the main thing that needs to be protected is this wide open space and the flexibility and all of that. And that's the space God wants me to operate in. And
Mhm.
if there's some reason that a collar may be helpful to that, which I'm not convinced of right now,
Mhm.
maybe we'll go that direction.
Well, if the spirit is moving you towards the diaconate, if that becomes the case, the fortunate thing is that with the diaconate, you are moved around.
Yes. And with the diaconate, you also are, I like operating outside the church walls. That's the space that I'm most interested in. So the diaconate kind of focuses on that. And the diaconate seems to be less, it seems to be more flexible and more open to, I think things work better for me when I get to design it, like my PhD that worked, like it was 100, like I got the funding, I designed it. It was, it was entirely in my hands
Mhm.
in terms, well, except for, needing to hand things in or whatever, but that's, whatever. But, designing the whole thing and figuring out what it was meant to be.
Right.
And I think I work better that way. So I don't know. I still, it's still a giant question mark for me, but
Yeah. Is there anything else you wish to share with us about your time at VTS?
yeah. So you asked me about whether the difference in environment that I noticed at VTS was student or faculty. And I think one of the things where it became clear to me that there was a wider degree of opinions and experiences in terms of how do you relate to LGBTQ plus people at VTS, was interestingly enough, through some of the events that we tried to organize through PRISM.
Mm,
And it was, so one of the things that I looked at, that I wanted to look at, was the calendar of different days of awareness, recognition, commemoration, and stuff like that. And the beginning of the year, it sort of tapered off because, I was going through other things by the end of the year. But at the beginning of the year, I was like, oh, okay, every day of awareness, or, whether it's bi or transgender or gay or lesbian or whatever, like every day that's on the LGBTQ plus calendar is a day of awareness raising. Wouldn't it be cool to do something and to have like a table outside the refectory and have, I don't know, stickers or, whatever, like do something
mhm,
for it, just so to raise awareness in the community. And it started out, I think the first day just on the calendar was the Bi Awareness Day. And I think, and that, that went well. I think that was, it was my first experiment sort of doing this kind of thing. It's our first experiment. And I don't know, it seemed to, go well. So I think the next day was Allyship Day, or is that ally recognition? I don't know, something like that. I don't remember exactly the term, but so I think, and it was, I wanted to do something that was organizationally not a burden. So basically just decking out a table and having stickers and, stuff like that. And I think part of, I don't remember whether we'd had conversations about this as well. I think we had.
mhm,
And I think part of the idea of that day was to have stickers available so that people could stop by and like stick them on and just sort of publicly recognize that they were allies or whatever, like to, have that be an option for people. And I had a really interesting, and I think at some point, like around lunchtime or something like that, I was kind of there around the table just in case folks had questions or something like that. I don't remember exactly whether that was like a thing that I decided to do, or I was just kind of hanging around going to check out and see, if it needed more stickers or what was happening. And I had a conversation with somebody um, who had a very interesting, I had an interesting conversation with her. She was at VTS. I'm not going to name any names or anything, but it was a conversation around what can we do to support you? And like, oh, this is such a great thing. I'm so glad that that you guys are doing this, because I'm so glad you guys are giving folks the opportunity to, recognize, to like show that they're allies and stuff like that. And what can we do to support you? And that was like, that's a super positive conversation. But on the other hand, I remember coming away from that feeling like, oh, that's interesting. That's really interesting. I think it was the first time that I had felt like an other,
mm,
because, and it would the it wasn't, so I'm not trying to say this to say that the person othered me or made me feel that way. Like they were I understand the place that conversation was coming from, and it was entirely genuinely sort of, friendly and positive. But it was interesting. It was sort of like, I think back to um one time at my home church when I was actually going to have an interview for some church related thing with someone who was deaf. And I wasn't, even though I've had, like, one of my cousins on my town side of the family is deaf, I wasn't quite sure how to approach her, because I think at some point that I had been made aware that she mostly spoke ASL and I don't speak ASL. So I was uncomfortable. And I was like, I wasn't quite sure. And I think I was self-conscious and the feeling that I was visibly uncomfortable, and I feel like she noticed it. And I sort of realized in that moment that because of my unfamiliarity with her experience in her world, and I didn't quite know how to relate to her. And that in my mind, she was kind of like an other that I needed to be sort of delicate around or careful around and wasn't quite sure how to relate to. It was really interesting. I'm like, oh, that's how it feels to be on this end of that. And I'm like, that's really interesting. I'm like, that's not when I say that sometimes it's qualitatively different, the atmosphere, the experience that I had from Bexley, like I'd never felt that at Bexley. Like I'd never felt from the environment that somebody wasn't quite sure what to do with me.
I see.
Not in a bad way, but you know what I mean? Like, but just, and expressing it in a kind of a, oh, how can we help? What can we do to support? Like in a very sort of like, I want to learn, I want to know, but you need to teach me.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow. I'm like, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Like, I'm like, I'm another for some folks here. I'm like, there are people who don't quite know what to do with me. Yeah, that was an interesting, that was sort of like a little bit of a wake-up call. And that's very, it's very mild. It's a mild experience. I'm not saying like I remember when we did, oh dear, what was the name of that? The coming out night? Like I think I've been naive to a certain extent, to some of the experiences, especially that the young gay men mentioned with the sort of re-education programs and stuff. Like I've been naive to some, like you hear about it, but you don't really know what it is. Like I was like, so no, I mean, there have been some very, very heartbreaking experiences that we heard that night. So that was extremely mild, but it was an interesting feeling. Like it was just sort of like, it was just kind of like, your stomach drops a little bit.
Well, and it also shows that VTS still has room to grow.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not, it's not an indictment. I'm not saying that it was hurtful or malicious, or it was sobering. It was sobering. And, it just sort of made you realize, which is why I say VTS probably is more a reflection of the actual reality of the Episcopal Church today. You know what I mean? Like most churches are a little bit more, at least in my experience, big tent and have a whole bunch of, and perhaps it's also happened to me because I have been, like in the experience in seminary, I felt comfortable enough to sort of claim fully, like claim my identity. Whereas in the congregations that I have been in, sort of an intern in Michigan and here, I have not been comfortable in coming out fully. And it's also been, yeah. So sometimes I feel like even like there's a dichotomy, like there's a definite dichotomy between seminary, and all seminaries are kind of like, at least the ones I've been to, or kind of a protected bubble space. And then you get into church and it's sort of like, especially, if folks know you're bi, it's like you either hear, well, I wouldn't mention that, or nobody cares. Which when I hear nobody cares, I'm like, really? Is that really true? Maybe it's true. I'm not sure it's true. Like, it's just, but you get this sort of subliminal message that like, don't harp on this thing. Like, don't put that out there. Like, you can pass, so why not pass?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a experience that a lot of people are reporting. And you say seminary, even VTS is a bubble,
Mm-hmm.
is what I've heard many people have said, you know.
Yep.
That seminary is not the church.
No.
And so your experience reflects others' experience as well. Thank you so much for sharing your story with me.
Well, thank you for doing this. I think it's important.
Thank you. I'm gonna stop the recording right now.
Mhm.